The sun hung low on the horizon as Jonathan Miller drove down the familiar winding road that led to his family's farm. His heart was light, filled with the satisfaction of having just wrapped up a lucrative 2-month consulting project in Dubai. The paycheck was hefty, enough to cover the farm's lingering debts and secure a stable future for his wife, Emily, and their son, Noah. But as he rounded the final bend, something felt wrong. The gentle sway of golden wheat fields, his childhood playground, was gone. The old wooden fence that had lined the property for generations had vanished. In their place stood a monstrous 3-story concrete structure, sleek glass windows reflecting the late afternoon sun like 1,000 unblinking eyes. Jonathan slammed the brakes, his silver SUV skidding slightly on the gravel road. His pulse pounded in his ears as he took in the sight before him. A fully operational hotel, its massive parking lot filled with cars, the manicured lawns and pristine landscaping a glaring contrast to the rustic charm that once defined his family's land. A massive sign loomed at the entrance. Oakwood Community Development, a vision of progress, HOA approved. Jonathan's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be real. His farm, his family's legacy, had been erased. He flung open the car door, his boots crunching against the gravel as he stepped onto what used to be his soil. A sharp gust of wind carried the scent of fresh paint and cement, so different from the rich, earthy aroma of wheat he had known his whole life. A few workers in hard hats bustled around the site, carrying materials, installing fixtures, going about their day as if nothing was amiss, as if they weren't standing on stolen land. Jonathan's hands curled into fists at his sides. Who the hell had done this? Then, his phone buzzed violently in his pocket. He yanked it out, his heart hammering as he read the message from Emily. "Jonathan, emergency, come home, now." His breath caught in his throat. Emily never panicked. He turned his gaze back to the hotel, his mind racing. How had this happened in just 2 months? They had secured everything before he left. The farm was not for sale. A worker, noticing Jonathan's stiff posture and hard stare, hesitated before approaching. He was young, clipboard tucked under one arm, eyes flickering with uncertainty. "Sir, can I help you?" Jonathan took a slow step forward, his voice calm, but laced with steel. "Yes. You can tell me why the hell there's a hotel on my land." The worker's expression shifted instantly, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "Wait. You're the owner?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. "I'm Jonathan Miller. My family has owned this land for 4 generations. The young man's Adam's apple bobbed. He took half a step back, suddenly looking like he wanted to be anywhere but here. I think you should speak with the project director." Jonathan didn't let him finish. His eyes had already locked onto something far more damning. Near the construction entrance, a second sign caught his attention. It wasn't large, but it didn't need to be. Its bold, blocky letters sent a chill down his spine. Project Director, Margaret Reynolds. Jonathan's vision tunneled. Margaret Reynolds. That name wasn't new. President of the Oakwood Homeowners Association. The woman who had spent years trying to make his family's farm disappear. The same woman who had written complaint after complaint about unsightly rural land being a blight on modern suburbia. The same woman who had once told him, "Your kind of land doesn't belong here anymore, Jonathan." His breathing turned slow and measured. Margaret did this. She had finally gotten what she wanted. His pulse roared in his ears as he turned on his heel, stalking back toward his SUV. He needed to get home. He needed answers. As he pulled away, his headlights briefly illuminated another sign, one he had missed before. Oakwood, building a future together. The irony was a slap in the face. Margaret Reynolds wasn't building anything, she was taking, and she had just declared war on the wrong man. Jonathan's SUV skidded to a stop in front of his house, tires kicking up dust as he flung the door open. The wooden porch creaked under his weight as he stormed up the steps. The house looked the same, familiar, safe, but his gut twisted with unease. Emily was already at the door, her face pale, eyes filled with something between panic and restrained fury. In her hand she clutched a thick stack of papers, documents that looked far too official for comfort. What the hell is going on? Jonathan demanded, his voice sharper than he intended. Emily exhaled slowly, pressing the papers into his hands. We lost the farm. Jonathan's heart stopped. What? They sold it, without our consent. Jonathan's fingers clenched around the papers. That's impossible. We never… Margaret Reynolds, Emily cut him off. The name alone was like venom on her tongue. She filed a rezoning application while you were gone. They classified part of our land as a community development zone, under HOA jurisdiction. That gave them the legal loophole to seize the property through eminent domain. Jonathan flipped through the papers, his pulse hammering. It was all there, approval stamps, signatures, permits, all wrapped up in a neat little package of legal jargon, meant to disguise theft as progress. His eyes locked onto a familiar name at the bottom of the document. Margaret Reynolds, HOA President and Project Director. Jonathan felt his breath turn to fire. That conniving… He stopped himself, inhaling sharply through his nose. His mind spun, grasping at how this could have happened so quickly. Emily's voice was quieter now, but no less urgent. Jonathan, she's been planning this for years. We should have known she wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted. Jonathan slammed the papers onto the kitchen table, his hands trembling with rage. I should have been here. Emily reached for him, gripping his wrist. No. She would have found a way no matter what. Her gaze was firm, unwavering. The question is, what do we do now? Jonathan didn't hesitate. We fight. The next morning, Jonathan drove straight to the construction site. This time, he wasn't just looking. He was hunting for evidence. The hotel loomed over the land like an invader, completely out of place in the rural landscape. Construction workers milled about, busy with their tasks. They barely spared him a glance. But Jonathan wasn't here for them. He wanted Margaret. His chance came sooner than expected. A sleek black Mercedes SUV pulled up to the site. The door opened, and out stepped Margaret Reynolds. Dressed in a navy blazer, her hair pulled into a no-nonsense bun, she looked every bit the queen of her little empire. A clipboard in one hand, designer sunglasses in the other, she surveyed the hotel with a satisfied smirk, as if admiring her latest conquest. Jonathan moved before he could stop himself. Margaret. Her shoulders stiffened, but when she turned to face him, her expression was calm, composed, too composed, like she had been expecting him. Jonathan, she greeted smoothly, slipping her sunglasses on. I was wondering when you'd show up. Jonathan's hands curled into fists at his sides. Cut the bullshit. You stole my land. Margaret sighed, tilting her head slightly. Stole? That's such an ugly word. I prefer… reallocated. Jonathan took a step closer, voice low with warning. You had no right. Oh, but legally, I did, she countered, gesturing toward the construction site. Everything is in order. The paperwork, the approvals, it's all legitimate. Jonathan gritted his teeth. You mean fraudulent. You rezoned my land behind my back. Margaret smirked. Your land? No, Jonathan. This land belongs to the community now. It's called progress. His rage burned hotter, but he forced himself to stay calm, calculating. Margaret wanted him angry, reckless. That's how she won against others before. Not this time. Jonathan glanced at the clipboard in her hand, his sharp eyes catching something. A stack of permits, legal forms, zoning documents. If he could get a closer look, Margaret caught the direction of his gaze and pulled the clipboard to her chest. I'd love to stay and chat, but I have a meeting to attend. She turned to leave. Jonathan wasn't finished. You've been planning this for a long time, haven't you? His voice was quiet, controlled, but the fury underneath was unmistakable. Margaret stopped. For a fraction of a second, her mask slipped. Jonathan saw it, the flicker of unease, the slight tightening of her grip on the clipboard. He had hit a nerve. Margaret exhaled through her nose, composing herself before turning back to face him, her smirk returning like a shield. I don't have time for conspiracy theories, Jonathan, she said dismissively. You lost. Move on. Jonathan held her gaze, unblinking, unyielding. Then he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a warning. Margaret frowned slightly, As if suddenly realizing he wasn't backing down, Jonathan took a step forward, his voice low and measured. "Enjoy this victory, Margaret," he murmured, "because it won't last." And for the first time, Margaret looked unsettled. The evening air was thick with tension as Jonathan Miller sat in the dimly lit barn, papers spread out across the old wooden workbench. Dust floated in the air, illuminated by the flickering light of a single overhead bulb. His hands trembled slightly as he sifted through the stack of aged documents in front of him. These weren't just old farm records. They were the last remnants of his family's history, and possibly his only hope of taking back what was stolen. Emily sat beside him, flipping through another pile of yellowed pages, her brows furrowed in concentration. Across from them, Raymond Henderson, their elderly neighbor, leaned forward, his weathered hands resting on a battered manila folder. "I always knew this day would come," Raymond muttered, his voice rough with age. "Margaret has been trying to get her hands on this land for decades." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Then why didn't you tell me sooner?" Raymond sighed. "Because I didn't have proof. Until now." With deliberate care, the old man slid the folder across the table. Jonathan hesitated before opening it, his heart hammering against his ribs. Inside, he found maps, letters, and legal documents, some dating back over 70 years. But one document, in particular, caught his attention. It was a hand-drawn property map from 1950, its edges frayed and brittle with time. Scribbled along the margins were notes in his grandfather's unmistakable handwriting. This can't be right," Jonathan whispered, his eyes scanning the intricate lines and annotations. Emily leaned over, reading along with him. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a faint red line running across the map's edge. "It marks a protected zone." Jonathan's stomach twisted. "A protected zone?" Raymond nodded. "That's what Margaret and the HOA don't want you to know. This land was designated as part of an ecological preservation area back in the 1940s. Your grandfather fought to keep it that way." Jonathan's mind raced. If this was true, then the hotel was built on illegally obtained land. His fingers traced the faded ink. "This means Margaret didn't just steal our land. She broke federal law." Raymond tapped a shaky finger on another document. "And that's not all. Look here." It was a letter from the county land registry, dated 1973. It referenced a land trust agreement, a legal mechanism meant to protect the land from commercial development. Jonathan's pulse spiked. This was the smoking gun. If this trust is still legally binding, Jonathan exhaled sharply, then that hotel is illegal, and Margaret knows it. Emily was already on her phone, snapping pictures of the documents. "Marcus needs to see these. If there's a legal loophole, he'll find it." Jonathan nodded, but something about the situation still nagged at him. Margaret was too smart to leave loose ends. If she went through all the trouble of forging documents and rezoning land, then she must have covered her tracks, or at least tried to. His gaze flickered to the corner of the barn, where an old rusted filing cabinet stood. He hadn't opened it in years, but his grandfather had always told him, "Never throw away a contract. They'll try to rewrite history, but paper never lies." Jonathan strode over, yanked open the heavy drawer, and began rummaging through the files. At first, it was just old tax receipts, maintenance logs, farm records. But then, a thin, leather-bound journal fell onto the floor. Jonathan crouched, carefully picking it up. The leather was cracked with age, the pages delicate beneath his fingertips. His grandfather's name was etched into the front cover. He flipped it open and immediately recognized his grandfather's precise, deliberate handwriting. Every land survey, every meeting with local officials, every negotiation with the county was documented. But one particular entry stood out. March 12, 1982. Margaret Reynolds' father approached me today. Same demand as always. Sell the land. He says it's for the town's progress. I told him no. I always tell him no. But something's different this time. He was too confident, too sure. I don't trust him. I need to be ready. Jonathan's blood ran cold. Margaret wasn't the first in her family to try and take this land. This fight had been going on for generations. Emily peered over his shoulder. Her father was involved in this? Jonathan clenched his jaw. It was never just about the land. This is personal. He turned the page. March 20th, 1982. They tried again, this time with paperwork. But I saw through it. I have copies of the real maps, the real agreements. If they ever try this again, the truth is here, hidden where no one will find it, unless they know where to look. Jonathan's heart slammed against his ribs. The truth is here. His eyes flicked up, scanning the barn. His grandfather wouldn't have written that unless he had hidden something important. Jonathan took a slow, deep breath, then turned to Raymond. Do you remember any places where my grandfather might have hidden important documents? Raymond thought for a moment before his face lit up with realization. The old storage loft. Jonathan didn't waste a second. He grabbed a flashlight and climbed the creaky wooden ladder up to the loft. Dust coated everything in thick layers. He ran his hands along the beams, feeling for anything unusual. Then, his fingers brushed against something metallic. A small, rusted lockbox was wedged into the corner. Jonathan pried it free, carried it down, and set it on the workbench. Emily handed him a crowbar. With one swift motion, he snapped the lock open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a sealed envelope. Jonathan peeled it open with shaking hands. Inside was a stack of legal documents, a series of photographs, and a handwritten letter. The letter was short, but its message was clear as day. If you are reading this, it means they've come for our land again. The fight isn't over, but neither is the truth. Everything you need to stop them is in these papers. You just have to know how to use them. Jonathan looked up at Emily. We have what we need. But before he could say anything else, the sound of tires crunching against gravel outside made them all freeze. Jonathan moved to the window and felt his stomach drop. A black SUV with HOA parking stickers had pulled up, and stepping out of the driver's seat, Margaret Reynolds. She wasn't smiling this time. She wasn't here to gloat. She was here to make sure he never found exactly what he just uncovered. Jonathan barely had time to react before the barn door swung open with a loud creak. Margaret Reynolds stepped inside, her heels clicking sharply against the old wooden floor. The dim barn light flickered over her poised frame, her perfectly pressed navy blazer stark against the dust-covered surroundings. Jonathan didn't move. He didn't need to. His heart was a steady drumbeat in his chest as he watched her. Busy evening? She asked smoothly, tilting her head as her cold gaze swept over the workbench, the scattered papers, the rusted lockbox, the letter in Jonathan's hands. Jonathan held her stare, his grip tightening around the documents. She knew. Margaret took a slow step forward. You know, I always admired your grandfather, she said, her voice laced with faux nostalgia. He was stubborn, yes, but he understood that progress is inevitable. Jonathan scoffed. Progress? Is that what you call this? He gestured toward the window, where the hotel construction loomed like an invader on sacred ground. Margaret's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. Call it what you want. But that land is no longer yours, Jonathan. Jonathan set the letter down carefully, stepping forward until they were inches apart. You mean, it's no longer mine because you stole it. Margaret didn't flinch, but something flickered in her eyes. Annoyance, maybe even the smallest trace of doubt. Don't be so dramatic, she said. Everything was done legally. Jonathan leaned in slightly. Funny, because I just found proof that says otherwise. Her smile froze. Jonathan let the silence hang. Let the weight of his words sink into her perfect composure like a crack forming in glass. Then he turned, picked up the old property map, and held it up for her to see. This land was part of a legally protected trust. You knew that, didn't you? Margaret's eyelids flickered, a brief misstep, but she quickly recovered. That document is outdated. No, Jonathan countered. It's buried. And for good reason. He held up the second document, the one from the county land registry, because it proves that my grandfather protected this land before you ever got your greedy hands on it. Margaret took another step forward, lowering her voice. For the first time, she looked serious. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into," she murmured. Jonathan smirked. "Oh, but I do." Margaret's jaw clenched, but before she could speak, another voice cut through the tension. "Jonathan?" Emily stood at the barn entrance, her phone in her hand, her expression unreadable. Jonathan turned, sensing something was wrong. "What is it?" Emily glanced at Margaret, then back at him. "I just got off the phone with Marcus." Jonathan's stomach tightened. The lawyer. The final piece of the puzzle. "And?" Emily swallowed, stepping further inside. "He found something." Margaret's fingers twitched at her sides. Jonathan turned back to her, his pulse steady, his mind sharp. He knew that whatever Marcus had uncovered would be the key to bringing her down. Margaret sighed, as if suddenly exhausted. "You really should just let this go." Jonathan exhaled a short laugh. "See? That's where you messed up." He stepped even closer, voice deadly calm. "You thought you were fighting against a farmer." His gaze turned ice cold. "But what you're actually up against is a man with nothing left to lose." Margaret's expression finally cracked, and that's when Jonathan knew. He had her. Jonathan's hands were steady, his mind razor-sharp as he stared at Margaret. She had built her empire on intimidation, manipulation, and deception, but she had underestimated him. She thought he would break. Instead, she had made him dangerous. Emily's phone buzzed again. Another message from Marcus Carter, their lawyer. She glanced at the screen, her eyes widening. "Jonathan," she said, her voice tight, urgent. "We need to go, now." Jonathan turned away from Margaret without hesitation. "I'll see you soon," he said over his shoulder, his tone dripping with absolute certainty. Margaret didn't respond, but as he walked away, he could feel her eyes burning into his back. They arrived at Marcus's office just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in streaks of amber and crimson. The tension in the room was thick as Jonathan, Emily, and Raymond gathered around the lawyer's cluttered desk. Marcus didn't waste time. He pulled up a series of scanned documents on his laptop, his expression hard. "I found it," he said. Jonathan leaned in. "Found what?" Marcus clicked on a file. A contract. The digital page flickered to life, and the second Jonathan saw it, his pulse kicked into overdrive. "This," Marcus continued, "is the fraudulent land transfer agreement that Margaret used to justify seizing your farm." Jonathan gritted his teeth. "I knew she forged something." "Oh, it's worse than that." Marcus zoomed in on a signature line at the bottom of the contract. "This document is supposed to have been co-signed by a county official." Jonathan frowned. "So?" Marcus smirked. "So, the person who supposedly signed this retired 10 years ago." The room went silent. Jonathan felt a rush of adrenaline surge through his veins. "You're telling me this contract," Marcus said, tapping the screen, "is fake, and since this is the primary document they use to rezone your land, it means the entire legal foundation of the hotel project is built on a fraud." Jonathan let out a slow, controlled breath. "Can we prove it?" Marcus nodded. "Absolutely. I have copies of the original land trust records, the zoning maps, and now, evidence of document tampering. This is more than enough to get the court to issue an injunction." Emily let out a breath of relief. "That means they have to stop construction, right?" "Not just stop it," Marcus said, his eyes gleaming. "If we play this right, they'll have to tear the whole thing down." Jonathan felt a sharp jolt of triumph. Margaret thought she had won, but she had made one critical mistake. She left a paper trail. The next morning, Jonathan stepped out of his truck, documents in hand, and walked straight into the county courthouse. The clerk at the front desk barely had time to react before he dropped the folder in front of her. "I need to file an emergency motion," he said, his voice calm but firm. The woman blinked. "For what?" Jonathan leaned in slightly. "To stop a criminally fraudulent land deal." She didn't ask questions after that. Within hours, the case was in front of a judge. Jonathan and Marcus sat across from Margaret and her high-powered attorneys in the courtroom. the tension thick enough to suffocate. Margaret's confidence was intact. For now. She sat poised, polished, pretending like she wasn't watching her entire scheme start to unravel. The judge, an older woman with sharp, knowing eyes, flipped through the evidence packet Marcus had provided. The room was silent, save for the occasional rustle of paper. Then, the judge spoke. "Miss Reynolds," her voice was neutral. "Would you care to explain why this contract," she lifted the fraudulent document, "bears the signature of a county official who has been retired for a decade?" Margaret's smirk faltered. Her lawyer cleared his throat. "Your Honor, I believe there may be a miscommunication." The judge cut him off with a raised hand. "Miscommunication?" Her voice hardened. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like fraud." Jonathan stole a glance at Margaret. For the first time, she looked rattled. "We will launch a formal investigation," the judge continued, "but effective immediately. All construction on the hotel is to be halted." Margaret stiffened. "And," the judge added, flipping another page, "given the fraudulent nature of this land transfer, we may also be looking at criminal charges." Jonathan watched as the color drained from Margaret's face. Checkmate. By the time the court order reached the construction site, Jonathan was already there. The workers were confused. Engineers scrambled for answers. The project manager was on the phone, barking into the receiver. Then, the county officials arrived. Jonathan stood off to the side, arms crossed, as they read the cease and desist order out loud. "This project is officially shut down," one of them announced. Margaret wasn't there to hear it, but she would soon enough. Jonathan turned, taking in the sight of the half-built hotel, a monument to her greed, now nothing more than a legal disaster waiting to be demolished. A slow smile spread across his face. Margaret thought she had crushed him, but she had only made him stronger. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that came before the final blow. Jonathan sat motionless at the plaintiff's table, hands folded, his heart a steady, controlled rhythm in his chest. Across from him, Margaret Reynolds sat rigid in her seat, her perfectly curated mask of confidence beginning to crack at the edges. The judge adjusted her glasses, flipping through the final set of documents, evidence that had taken months to gather, secrets buried beneath decades of deception. Jonathan had spent his whole life believing that justice was slow, that people like Margaret always won because they had money, power, and connections. But today, he was about to prove otherwise. The judge cleared her throat. "I have reviewed all evidence presented, including the fraudulent signatures, the illegal rezoning maneuver, and the historical documents proving that this land was never legally transferable." She turned her sharp gaze to Margaret. "Miss Reynolds, do you have anything to say in your defense?" For the first time, Margaret hesitated. Her hands, which once held power like an iron grip, twitched slightly against her pristine blazer. She knew it was over. Her empire, built on manipulation, was collapsing. Finally, she exhaled, lifting her chin just slightly. "This is a mistake." The judge didn't flinch. "No, Miss Reynolds. The mistake was thinking you could take what wasn't yours, and that no one would fight back." The gavel slammed. "The court rules in favor of Jonathan Miller. The land must be returned to its rightful owner. The Oakwood Hotel project is to be dismantled immediately. Furthermore, Miss Reynolds and the Homeowners Association will be investigated for fraud and land theft." Margaret went pale. Jonathan didn't smile. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. 1 month later, Jonathan stood at the edge of his farm, watching as the massive cranes tore down the half-built hotel, piece by piece. For the first time in months, he felt at peace. Emily stood beside him, slipping her hand into his. "You did it." He turned to her, exhaling. "We did it." Nearby, Raymond watched with quiet satisfaction. "I never thought I'd see the day," he murmured. Jonathan looked at the soil beneath his feet. The same land his grandfather had fought to protect. The same land Margaret had tried to steal. It wasn't just about dirt and property lines. It was about legacy. It was about knowing when to stand up and say enough. Because in the end, the only thing more powerful than corruption is the will to fight back, the lesson that matters. This wasn't just a battle over land. It was a battle over truth. Margaret and people like her thrive on fear. They count on people staying silent, on believing they are too small to fight back. But that's the greatest lie of all. Jonathan had nothing but an old barn, dusty papers, and his determination. Yet, he exposed corruption, tore down a system of greed, and reclaimed what was stolen. And if he could do it, so can you. A message to you. How many times in your life have you felt powerless? How many times have you seen injustice, but convinced yourself that you couldn't do anything about it? Here's the truth. You are stronger than you think. Sometimes, the only thing standing between you and victory is the belief that you can win. So when the world tells you to sit down and stay silent, stand up. Speak out. Fight back. Because someone has to. And maybe that someone is you. If this story inspired you, make sure to subscribe to The Story Forge. Hit the like button, drop a comment below, and tell us. What's a battle you've had to fight for what's right? Let's keep the conversation going. Because every story deserves to be told.